My first thought when I see an employment gap is red flag, for sure. I had an individual that I was recruiting for an opportunity who shared with me his employment gap, and his explanation was when he was working for his current company, they didn't approve his PTO. It's never about me looking at someone with a gap and saying, no way. It's saying, how can I help and what have they done to help themselves? So what do I think the difference is between an active and passive candidate? Well, I think there are actually a few differences. An active candidate is someone typically that is unemployed, who usually is seeking to get back into employment rather quickly because they need income. And so what ends up happening with that individual is they're a little bit more tricky to peg down. With a passive candidate, you kind of know what exactly you're looking for. It's a lot easier to have conversations about their needs and wants versus an active candidate who might veil their needs and wants in order to obtain a position a little bit more quickly. So in other words, they may forego the perfect fit for themselves just to get back into employment, which is understandable, while a passive candidate is typically only looking for that perfect fit. My first thought when I see an employment gap is red flag, for sure. That does not mean that they're necessarily not redeemable, but there's definitely some exploratory conversations that have to be had around that gap. It's something that's important to address, certainly. And if the explanation makes sense and is logical, and oftentimes there are some logical reasons for employment gaps, it's not something that I think has a big impact on their candidacy. I would say a good explanation sometimes revolves around maybe they had to take a leave of absence for medical reasons. I've had that happen in a few circumstances, and that's very reasonable. We have things in our lives beyond our control. Oftentimes those situations do arise when we don't want them to, and we have to address them to make sure we're happy and healthy so we can continue working at the best of our capacity. I would say if they were looking to make a career change, sometimes that happens. Maybe they get pretty far into a field and realize they have more interest in another field, and oftentimes they have to take some time to leave the current field that they're in, develop themselves and prepare themselves with the skill set that they're going to need in the new field, and then engage in that new career path. And so sometimes those are great explanations as well. On the bad example for someone with an employment gap, and this is funny because this is actually a true story. I had an individual that I was recruiting for an opportunity who shared with me his employment gap, and his explanation was when he was working for his current company, they didn't approve his PTO. And so he had this vacation that he wanted to take, and so he decided to quit that company just to take a vacation. And when I asked him, okay, while that's somewhat unreasonable in my opinion, how come it took you so long to find another role? And he said, well, every time I tried to explain why I left my last position, no one gave me an opportunity. Say the company previous to them closed, or they were offered a buyout of their position and they'd taken it. And this happened a lot back in 2007, 2008 with General Motors. They offered everyone a buyout. A lot of people took that buyout. Most of those people took the buyout and then immediately found employment elsewhere. But there were a few who took the buyout and remained unemployed for many years. And it became very challenging for those individuals to find employment because the gap had gotten so wide that it tended to reflect poorly on them as their motivation for working. And I think that's what you've really got to consider when you're going to leave a position is how much time are you going to take to find another role before actually making that decision, because oftentimes it can really typecast you. And fair or unfair to you, it does make it a little bit more difficult to recruit you for a role for a client. I think there actually are times when a gap could potentially serve a candidate pretty well. A few examples would be continued education, changing career fields, going and doing self-improvement, taking workshops or classes, maybe not necessarily going to university to obtain new skill sets, but learning a new field, working both on a professional level to grow, but on a personal level. Sometimes that's required in high stress job situations, and there are many of those out there. Oftentimes you need some time to really take a sabbatical, recharge your batteries, collect yourself before you can enter back in. There's a couple of those fields in the medical industry that are really challenging at times. If you were to go from one right to the other, you need sort of that break to mentally collect yourself. And that's both a reasonable time to have a gap, but it also is an improvement to yourself because ultimately you become the best version of yourself when re-engaging in the workforce. There's a threshold in my mind of how much is too much of a gap. And then if the explanation doesn't sync up with that, it does make it really challenging. But I'm not saying you're not redeemable. In fact, one of my best placements I've ever had was somebody who took the buyout from GM, also ended up getting a divorce during this period of time. So personally, down in the dumps. Professionally, had some runway, but that quickly ran out, and just couldn't motivate himself to get back in because he was in a state of depression. And then that shifted a year later to now no one's given me an opportunity because it's been so long. And one of my most rewarding moments as a recruiter was taking that individual, working with them, seeing the redeemable qualities in that person, finding a role. Wasn't at the level that he wanted or was seeking initially, but it was very near to, with a path for him to return to where he was. And when he got that offer, he couldn't thank me enough, wrote me a 2-page email, and it was like, those are the wins. Those are the things I recruit for, right? Those moments. And so it's never about me looking at someone with a gap and saying, no way. It's saying, how can I help? And what have they done to help themselves? And if it makes sense, I'll absolutely work with them and fight for them just as much as a passive candidate.